Boomers had Bewitched, Gen X had Hocus Pocus, Gen Y, Harry Potter, Gen Z, Elsa, and Gen Alpha, WitchTok. Every generation loves them a good witch. And while witches depicted in pop culture is nothing new, it might feel like there's an uptick in people actually identifying as witches. It's murky waters when things like tarot cards, positive affirmations, and Christmas trees all get lumped into the same witchy brew. My next guest is the Whitehead Associate Professor of Critical Thought and Associate Professor of Philosophy at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Her primary research focus is on metaphysics and ethics of human freedom in the early modern period. So today, we're going to conduct a seance, but instead of connecting the living with the dead, we're going to connect the modern with the historical as we ask the question, is actual witchcraft making a comeback? Lover of knowledge, investigator of history, and connector of dots, Professor Julie Walsh. Thanks for being here.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to steal seance to help my students understand why history is important. I feel like I just love that so much.
Oh,
I'm very excited to talk to you.
Oh, good. I'm so glad that you love it. I love this topic because I legit have met so many people, probably in the last 4 or 5 years, that very openly identify as a witch to some degree. I'll never forget the first time where someone handed me their business card and they were like, and I'm a witch. And I was like, pretend this is normal. Like as I accepted their business card. It was at a moon circle. So maybe I set myself up for that one. But
it seems like a pretty average day at the office if you're in a moon circle.
Yeah, it was my own fault. But I mean, historically, I've definitely thought as witches as just an option for like a children's Halloween costume. What's the earliest account of the word witch?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is not really a straightforward question to answer, which in my line of work makes it all the more interesting. So one of the things that I love to do when I have questions of that kind is I look to the etymology of the word. So I love trying to figure out, okay, well, so we have this word, we use it in a particular kind of way, but looking at the root of the word, the language group from which it comes, and the way that it's changed its definition over time gives us a huge amount of insight into how the word is used and like where we might find it. So the word witch, spelled W-I-C-C-E, comes from Old English, where the double C had a ch sound. So W-I-C-C-E was a word for a male. W-I-C-C-A is a word for a female witch. And really, it was defined as somebody who practices magic and certainly not gendered in, around the 13th century. And it didn't have an obvious connection with evil. So that's sort of one of the earlier kind of English language uses that we have record of.
Can I interrupt? You said it didn't have an obvious association with evil. Then what was it associated with?
Magic. Yeah. So this is I know.
Okay.
So when we look at the history of witches and the kind of term witchcraft, what we're really doing is looking at the history of superstition and of magic. And that history is long. And in fact, it's so long that it far predates the recorded history that we have access to. So cultures all over the world, all across time, including our time, people have believed in magic, have been superstitious. And the way that we associate certain words to those beliefs just changes over time.
Oh.
So some of your listeners may be familiar with the Witch of Endor, which is a story in the Hebrew Bible. It's a really early use of the word witch. But when you kind of go back and look, it's like, well, it sort of depends on what translation you're reading, whether or not the word witch is used to describe that person. Sometimes it's sorceress, sometimes it's practitioner of resurrection. So who's translating it, in what era is it being translated, will sort of shift which words are being used. Because today, I think actually the word witch is going through a bit of a renaissance, but also but a rebrand. Yes, it's absolutely being rebranded. But you can imagine if somebody was talking about that biblical story in the 17th century, they might use the word witch purposefully because it connoted something evil, something in league with the devil, something, really decidedly feminine. So when we look across time, these words are sort of, they're living, they're constantly evolving depending on the cultural context, depending on what people needed to say and what they wanted to convey with it. So I think that's one thing that I think is really exciting about this topic, is that it helps surface for us how powerful our language is. And our word choice can make a huge difference, both with respect to communicating what we want our audience to take from us, but also in further reinforcing biases and prejudices and other kinds of, ways of categorizing people and stereotyping people.
Oh, you had me at etymology, Julie. I love this already. Okay, so let's fast forward to what we all think of the beginning of historical witchcraft, which is the Salem witch trials. But it's important to note that in prepping for our conversation, I learned that that was not really the beginning of witch persecution. But let's just start there because most people are familiar with it. How was witch defined in that moment in history?
Yeah, well, we gotta go back a couple hundred years. I'm so sorry. We'll get to Salem in just a minute.
Okay. Let's go. Let's do it.
But so Salem was populated by people who fled religious persecution in England. So one thing that we have to remember when we're thinking about Salem in the cultural context is that the people who were in Salem left England because they didn't think England was religious enough. So they were escaping what they saw as a community that was sort of degraded morally. And they wanted to find a place where they could practice their religion in a way that was consistent with the standards that they set for themselves. So this is a very, very theologically robust community in Salem. But in order to kind of think a little bit more about what happened there and why it happened, we have to go back a good 200 years to, in my view, really what I would think of as the starting point of the particular kind of European and colonial American witch hunts that existed, which is the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum. So that's Latin, which translates to Hammer of Witches. So it was published in 1487 by two Dominican friars. We could, talk for hours about this book, but what's important to surface for the book is that these authors sort of cobbled together bits of folklore, bits of other texts, kind of ideas that were in the marketplace of ideas at the time, and they articulated three connected claims. So claim number one, witches exist, and they're almost all women because women are morally weak. So Garden of Eden, Eve, that's the kind of reference point for that. Claim number two is that women are sexually insatiable, and that sexuality, that hypersexed character of women, is what makes them more likely to compact with the devil, because there was this idea that in engaging with the devil, you engage in orgies, and the devil himself can sexually satisfy these depraved women.
Can I just say that
You have follow-up questions about that? I'm surprised.
Holy balls, Batman. Like, first of all, obviously, I held back my laughter successfully for the first one. And then I couldn't hold it for the second one because I talked to this lady about antique vibrators once, and we talked about the history of them. And basically, men were not getting women all the way. Like, they were not able to finish. And so enter the vibrator, like as far back as supposedly Cleopatra with her box of bees, right? And so this is cracking me up because I'm like, oh, okay, so a bunch of guys were like, we don't know how to satisfy her, so therefore she's a witch. Like, that's where my head was at. I will now sit back in my seat and be a better student. But I just couldn't. That just came out. Sorry.
No, it's interesting because I think this is what is so exciting about history. To put on my nerd hat for a moment, is that there are things to us that seem ridiculous and hilarious. but they influenced our culture in a way that we still see today. Like, where does sexism come from? I mean, why is it still so prevalent today? It's because of stories like this that just gripped the imagination of a community, and the ideas just kept living across time. So this book has these ideas of women's dispositions and ties womanhood, women's sexuality to the devil. So why is it that most witches are women? Because they're sexually insatiable, and the devil can help alleviate that insatiability. So this text was, like, in today's terms, we would call it, like, it went viral. It had multiple printings. This was in the very early age of the printing press. It was translated into multiple different languages. It became part of cleric law in parts of European countries. So it was created as a manual for identifying witches. And then the whole kind of third part of the text is a step-by-step guide to interrogating, torturing, and punishing them.
Wow.
So this text, and it wasn't the only one, but it really was like the big blockbuster, became these easy reference manuals for people to exact these hunts. So this is kind of coming out of Germany and spreading across Europe. And by the time the witch hunts happen in Salem, we've had 200 years of this ideology kind of floating around. And the ideology isn't just among clerics and lay people, it's being preached in churches. And the idea of the devil is among us, the devil is trying to tempt good people, you, your neighbors, the kind of us versus them ideology becomes incredibly central to the conflict in Salem.
I can see now why you needed to take a step back, because knowing that there was 200 years of layers of thought really does paint a picture, not just for the time of Salem, but you just caused me to remember that that was taught at my church in the late 90s, that, you know, that women are more susceptible to temptation is how it was worded to me. And not necessarily from the pulpit. If anyone from that community is listening, it may have been just amongst us, you know, churchgoers that it was circulated. But still, it does speak to the power of uninterrogated beliefs.
No question. And I think this is why I love this topic and the range of topics that you discuss on this platform, because we do so much in our lives. We say things, we practice rituals, we celebrate holidays. And for many of us, we never stop to think like, well, why do we do that? What's going on here?
Right.
I don't have an easy answer to the question of why we practice certain things at different times of the year, why we go through these different kinds of, like, you know, national or religious or secular rituals together. So interrogating them and doing a little bit of reading, I think, helps us better understand ourselves and also, you know, the world.
Absolutely. So to go back to the original question of Salem times and how they defined a witch, was it like you were female? Or is there more to it?
Yeah. So by the time we get to the late 1600s in Salem, the definition of a witch has become, this is somebody who uses magic to cause harm. And again, by this time, having some kind of contract with the devil is like a particularly important piece of the definition. And if I may, just as a quick sidebar, there are also like a whole like hornet's nest of questions about why God would permit the devil to give witches power that is supernatural.
Oh.
So, like, that's a whole other question that I'm very interested in. So we can bookmark that for a moment.
Okay.
But that's a really interesting question. So that's the basic definition at this time. And what happens in Salem is that in the home of the minister, Paris, in Salem in the early 1690s, his daughter and niece start to kind of have episodes claiming that they were being bewitched, that they were being harmed, they were being tortured by unseen spirits. And another sort of feature of this story is that another member of Paris's household was Tituba, who was an enslaved woman who was trafficked from, it's not quite clear exactly where she came from. Earlier accounts suggested the Caribbean. There's at least one anthropological study that suggests that she may have been originally from like an indigenous person from Venezuela. But her presence in the home, I think, sort of shifted the perception of what might be happening. So she was immediately thrown in jail and interrogated, like, what did you, Tituba, do? What's going on here? And she immediately confessed, yes, witchcraft. And she said, there was a man in black from Boston who came to me and said he would give me power. And I agreed. And I'm very sorry. Yes. So yeah, why? One of the reasons why she may have done that is she may have very quickly seen the writing on the wall. She's the only Black woman in this story. Somebody has kind of identified witchcraft in the home, and she may have thought to herself, I know exactly where this might end, so maybe better to admit it and ride it out. Another thing that's really interesting is her association of the devil with Boston. So, the geography between Boston and Salem, very close. But of course, in the 1690s, it's a pretty intense distance to travel by horse and cart. So she kind of externalizes the source of evil. Evil's not in Salem. Evil's in Boston. So maybe playing on some of the fears of people living in Salem, that Boston is the big city and evil lives over there. And what happened with Tituba is she stayed in jail for the entirety of the trials and then was released. And from what we can tell, she was immediately sold to another family and her record ends there. So far, hopefully there might be more to discover. But what ends up happening is in a very short period of time, there is, in Salem, 20 people were executed. Many, many, many more were jailed. And there's no exact number of the people who died in jail. So the jails were often flooded. They were cold. Anybody who was infirm and jailed usually didn't survive. So 19 people were hanged. One person was pressed to death. And the one person who was pressed to death was a man. All the other people were women. And what we kind of see happening in Salem is that once the young girls started to level accusations, it just sort of became like a cascade, like a domino effect of people accusing one another. And theorists have tried to map, like, okay, was it poor people accusing richer people? Was it neighbors who had pre-existing beef who were using witchcraft to kind of settle scores? And it's actually really hard. There's no easy and clean way of really understanding how the accusations happened and what the reasoning was. But I'll just say that in Salem, things happened very quickly. And one of the things that makes the Salem case unique is that they instituted a special court to deal with witchcraft accusations. They called it the Court of Oyer and Terminer. It's still in French, but in English of the time, they would use Oyer and Terminer. So Oyer for to hear and Terminer for to determine. So it was an expedited courtroom just for witchcraft associations where people would hear and then immediately determine whether somebody was guilty. And the second thing they allowed was spectral evidence. So you can imagine if I said to a court, last night I woke up and Meredith's specter was in my bedroom and she was poking me with a hot poker. How would you defend yourself against that claim?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, well, I was over here. I wasn't there. I was at home. My husband can attest, but it wouldn't matter because it'd be my ghost.
Exactly, right? So your husband is like, no, she was here.
Yeah.
And then I say, yeah, she might have been at home, but her specter was in my bedroom, charming me. So you can imagine with a court system where you just have to hear and determine whether or not somebody's a witch or whether or not somebody's guilty. And you allow as legitimate evidence, I saw somebody's specter do something nefarious. People had no chance.
Hey, quick question. You seem to be enjoying this episode so far, but have you hit the follow button on your podcast player? Take a second to follow the show so you never miss an episode. I promise to keep bringing you the bright, meaningful content that you've come to expect. Okay, back to the interview. So this is really painting a picture of chaos, and it really does present as such a sharp contrast to people wanting to be identified as witches. But before we jump to present day, I have one more question about this period in the past. I have heard that the hysteria of witchcraft was due to like a fungus in wheat. And I have additionally heard that it was actually a land grab by men because the women who owned property, they would continue to own it unless they married. So unmarried women were kind of like a hindrance to the progression of men in society owning land because these women were in the way. But if they were convicted of witchcraft, then that ownership could be transferred. Are there any truth to either of those?
Okay, well, I'll take them in turn. So the first one is sort of an evergreen story that is absolutely false. But, you know, it's from the 1970s. There was a scientific paper published in, I think it was Science magazine, so a very prestigious scientific journal. The New York Times covered it. And what the researchers claimed was that a particularly rainy season had led to this fungus growing. I think it was rye, maybe. And that because the people were eating bread and cakes made from this grain, they all essentially it was like they were on LSD for like a year and a half.
Right. What an
and
interesting time to have that theory, because that's like the rise of feminist autonomy. Like, oh, no, don't worry. It wasn't sexism. It was ergot. It's all good, guys. Don't worry.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the 1970s, you have the rise of feminism, also the rise of LSD.
Oh,
maybe there's something in that. I don't know.
Wow. This is all coming together. Okay.
So the reason why that theory doesn't really stand up to scrutiny is that everywhere in New England experienced the same rainy season, and yet no other place had this kind of episode. So something else was going on in Salem. And I think I won't say much more about it, but I think I've been quite convinced by some researchers who claim that the kind of special thing that was happening in Salem was the minister and the way that he led his congregants to thinking about good versus evil. The bit about land, so you've heard that in connection with Salem in particular, or with witch hunts kind of more generally?
This was WitchTok. This is, I'm citing my source, except for I don't have TikTok. So it was Instagram, and it was just like some lady in a bathrobe with her wine and her hair in a towel. And she was like, listen up, kids, this is the real reason. And I was like, gonna talk to Julie about this.
No. So there is a theorist named Silvia Federici who wrote a very influential book called Caliban and the Witches. I'm looking back because I think I have it up there somewhere. And she has kind of a very long-form argument about colonialism, especially land, and witchcraft. So she brings this argument to bear on discussions about accusations of witchcraft, usually in parts of the world that have been under like imperial or colonial rule, for whom understandings about property and private property are changed as a result of their like kind of living under the oppression of colonial or imperial rule. I've never heard that argument with respect to Salem or, you know, with respect to witch hunts happening in Europe or in colonial US. I'm very open to hearing about it. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
In particular.
You know, I think she was American. I don't know. She could be Canadian. But she just said the witch hunts. She didn't really specify. Yeah. But I thought I'd throw that in there because it's an interesting theory.
Maybe one thing just to note, too, is that in the US, like colonial America was like, people love to sue each other. It was a real litigious space.
Really?
So there's like a lot of lawsuits. And so it's definitely not impossible that there could have been stuff about witchcraft intermingled with stuff about property disputes. So like even in Salem and other parts of New England, you can see witch accusations associated with somebody who's like, I sold you a pig 10 years ago, still waiting on the money. Like you said, you know, pay me over a course of years. So kind of thinking about property with respect to cattle. So yeah, like if you have like a rainy afternoon and you want to dig through some online archives, I mean, people kind of, I guess you could say that the US today is very friendly to lawsuits and litigation. Mm-hmm. It was so much more.
I had no idea. I had no idea. Okay, so fast forward to today, people, specifically women, are quick to, as we discussed earlier, hand you their business card at a moon circle and shake your hand and say, hi, I'm a witch. Where does the desire to identify as a witch come from I guess for mostly females. Is it because of the sexism? What's the connection there?
I think this is a really interesting modern phenomenon. And I think, over the last 100 years, and maybe even more so recently, people, especially young people, have been moving away from the church, like organized religion in general. And, moving away from organized religion isn't always synonymous with moving away from belief in something spiritual. And I'll say something spiritual in the broadest possible sense, something that exists beyond the sphere of our perceptual awareness. And so I think the movement away from the church really has left a lot of people, young people, maybe in particular women, looking for other more or less formalized ways to come together with like-minded people and talk about their beliefs, practice their beliefs, and I think importantly, feel empowered. So there are many organized religions where young people and women, and maybe even especially young women, are not feeling empowered when they are practicing their religion or when they're in their religious communities. And the modern witch movement seems very focused on empowerment and empowerment through autonomy. So there's certainly a benefit to being in community with one another, but there's also a possibility of practicing your craft, practicing your beliefs on your own. And that is actually not a typical feature of organized religion. Just kind of being alone and thinking about what you believe, enjoying nature, enjoying animals, kind of developing relationships with the natural world without tithing, without a senior, usually man, usually white man, telling you the right way to practice, or when you should practice, or when you should be ashamed of certain things, or when you should be proud of other things. So I think that the modern witch community offers an empowerment that is maybe closer to a kind of secular empowerment, but nevertheless without judgment about holding on to beliefs in something that's beyond what we presently understand.
Is there a bit of decolonization in that too? Because at my moon circles, that was a theme. Several of the women were of Native background, and I myself was inspired to think about what I imagined to be my own ancestors and what would have been their relationship with spirit. They would have been pagan because, Northern Europe, right? So they would have had a ritual around the moon. They would have celebrated the summer solstice and all that stuff. So is that part of it, is like we in the Western world, because we often don't know who our ancestors are, we're just sort of guessing, that there's like this desire to reconnect in a way?
Yeah, that might definitely be part of it. And when you look at the way that earlier communities, for lack of a better word, like the way that they ritualized their lives, it was all organized around the seasons. And of course it was, because pre-industrialization, if you had a brutal winter, that could be a death sentence for your family. So there were rituals organized around the winter solstice. And like December 25th in, pre-Christian communities was celebrated because it marked the beginning of more daylight each day after the winter solstice. You have spring festivals to mark survival after winter and the beginning of growth, right? Yeah. We had summer festivals to celebrate the longest day of the year. Like, of course, you would have a party on the day you would have the most daylight. Of course, that would be your biggest party of the year before you had electricity, right? So just thinking about the way that our ancestors, everybody's ancestors, would have ritualized the seasons as they experienced them in their parts of the world, because it was critical for food production, for, thinking about growth and building in community. So I think the way that the modern witch movement is connected with the natural world very much taps into that. And I think it is true that being more aware of our natural spaces is, in some senses, much closer to the spiritual and religious practices of our community members who don't practice monotheism. So certainly it's not the same, it can't be the same, but there might be some interesting parallels that make broadening the community with respect to these sorts of practices more possible.
Yeah, absolutely. You said off mic that identifying as a witch, claiming it as an identity, comes with risk. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think the risks are at least twofold. So one risk is stigmatization. So it's still certainly the case, maybe very similar to what you've described, when somebody identifies as a witch. Even for very open-minded people who go to moon circles, it might still kind of come as a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
But I think we don't really know what that means. We don't know, for the person that you met, it was clearly very important to their identity to foreground that. So, it's sort of risky, I think, in the sense of you're definitely going to invite follow-up questions. And it might also turn people off in ways that are irrecoverable. But the other risk, I think, has to do with the presumed or assumed connection to the people who were executed during the early modern witch hunts. It's very hard to have easy answers for why they happened, because that why is different in different countries, in different communities, in different cases. But one thing that I think is certain is that there were no witches in early modern Europe or colonial America. Everybody who was executed believed in witches because everybody did, but we had no evidence that anyone was practicing anything like what we would kind of conceive of as witchcraft today. So I think when the modern witch movement connects itself either explicitly or even implicitly to, the tens of thousands of people who were executed for this alleged crime, I think there's a real moral risk in that there's absolutely no continuity between the early modern witch hunts and the modern witches of today. So I think there are certainly people who identify as modern witches who claim ancestral connections with people who were executed or who were accused. But there's a very clear disanalogy between these groups. On the one hand, we have historical people who were, for the entirety of their persecution, they were denying they were guilty of this crime. And it's very hard for me to understand how modern witches, to the extent that they do claim connection with that group, it's very hard for me to see the sort of texture of that connection. One of the things that I sometimes think about is we talk a lot these days about cultural appropriation, but it's hard to say that you can practice cultural appropriation for a culture that never existed. So on the one hand, I don't think modern witches are practicing cultural appropriation because there's no culture to appropriate. But I think some modern witches do think that there is a culture that they are appropriating. So I think it's risky in the sense of packing in assumptions about one's lineage with respect to their spiritual practice.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of these traditions are from Northern Europe, like of the modern day witch, like the moon circles and tarot. That might have been of the Romani people, so maybe not Northern Europe, but like a neighbor. But it's strange to me what makes it into the mainstream versus what is considered nowadays, a taboo witch, a taboo kind of witch, like wear that for a Halloween costume, but like what we would call a voodoo doll is a no-go. We can wear a necklace with the likeness of a dead person, and that's called a saint. And it protects us, it protects police officers. So it's okay. But like a gree-gree bag, which is something you put in your pocket for protection, is a no-go. I've been obviously knee-deep in this subject since meeting you. So it could be me looking too much into it. So please
No,
have.
you're not.
It just seems a little bit racist that the brown people traditions don't make it in, but we're going to take the Christmas tree, we're going to take the Easter bunny, we'll do bridesmaids, we'll do making a wish when you blow out a birthday candle. But if it was like on an altar, if it was some other situation, that would be taboo. Like, tell me, am I looking too much into it?
No, I mean, this is about power and consolidating power. I think you're exactly right. So when we think about the cultural practices, as you say, that are licit and the ones that are deemed illicit, I think we always have to ask ourselves, who gains from this practice being allowed and this other practice being disallowed? And when it comes to these sorts of more outside of organized religion practices, if a certain practice is disallowed, it's often to preserve a kind of hegemony of power. And I think you're exactly right. There's a lot of fear and loathing associated with cultural practices, especially kind of witch or witch adjacent from parts of South America, parts of Africa. There's a lot of magic and witch traditions in China, in India. Those practices are not being imported to the US, or at least not yet in the mainstream. But of course, Americans are really, really good at not liking something for a long time and then slowly taking bits of it for their own purposes and then sort of reinventing it for themselves. So, we should check back in a couple of years to see if some of those witch practices have been imported.
And there's pros and cons to that too, right? The con is like, we may not give your culture credit, but the pro is we're not going to persecute you because now we think it's cool.
Yeah. I think just the point that you made about the kind of saint necklace too, I think when we think about, Catholicism in particular, there's all kinds of rituals associated with Catholicism that feel very witchy.
Totally.
And yet they're perfectly accepted in kind of present day, like religious culture who practice those rituals. And you mentioned tarot. I mean, this is one of the things that I was thinking about in preparation for our call is why are we invested in things that are old? So why is the magic of Catholicism acceptable and the magic of, the Mormon Church or Scientology that are much newer religions, again, like for most of the mainstream, considered ridiculous? When you sort of compare the cosmology of these religions, they're different, but as far as being supernatural and sort of amazing, they're kind of similarly amazing. And with the tarot, I mean, tarot seems to date from the 14th or 15th century in Italy as playing cards. And it only became associated with fortune telling in the occult like 400 years later. But people who are really interested in tarot, there's a kind of thread of people who want to try to make the argument that it's always been about the occult. And even when it was just playing cards, it was hiding that it was about the occult. There's no evidence for that, but there's something about making it old that seems to lend credence or authority to the practice. And I think that's also a really interesting thing. Like, we just give things a pass if it's through the kind of machinations of tradition. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, like exorcism, prayer, okay, that all makes sense. But, this newer practice, that seems ridiculous. We're not going to allow it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's also an element of commercialism at work here. Because when it comes to the modern day witch, there are many an accessory one can buy. Like, I love me a good crystal shop. I sure do. And I don't really subscribe to the idea that crystals can help you do X or Y. I just like pretty rocks, to be honest. But when you are in these moon circles, particularly, this is really where all my research comes from, is the dang,
I'm getting that.
The dang moon circle. Yeah. Well, it's funny earlier that you mentioned women looking for ritual and tradition, and that is 100% what I was doing. I was like, I want to be more aware of my natural environment. Okay, we'll be paying attention to the cycle of the moon. I would like to gather with other women and meditate and journal and have a designated appointment. I drove 45 minutes one way just to go to this thing. And, to be with other women and be in a space and there's, candles and incense and we eat and it was lovely. But that is also where I learned that, we have bracelets and we have specialty design tarot cards and we have, fabrics that are a higher frequency, like cotton and linen, don't wear polyester. And there's like all these ways to participate through your debit card. And I also wonder if that appeals to most of us because let's face it, it's fun.
Yeah. Well, and, I think what you've described too is a great description of present day Salem, Massachusetts. If you go to Salem, I was going to say you can't throw a stone without hitting like a tarot or crystal or witch shop, but that's even too extreme. Like every single step you take, there's a new one. And it's just a constant bombardment of an invitation to spend money on trinkets that are meaningful only because this is a place where people were executed. So I think that the commercialization of horror and violence is not new. I mean, there's a gift shop outside of Auschwitz, right? So, this is not like a new thing that humans do, is like commodifying horror and violence. But commodifying spirituality, also not new.
Yeah.
We know the Catholic Church sold indulgences and made a lot of money from them. So again, and I think this is why the modern witch movement is so interesting. Can it withstand commercialization and co-opting from people who want to profit from people who are seeking community and seeking spiritual connection? It seems like from your experience, maybe the answer is not really. Maybe some places, but not here. But I think that's a really powerful move if there can be a spiritual group, especially in the US, that can withstand that kind of commercial force.
I mean, positions available. What do you say about that? Well, as we wrap up, I would love to hear your thoughts on where do we go from here, right? We've interrogated our thoughts. We've investigated our lesser known history. We've opened up our For You page on Amazon Prime. We've done all the things, but for the person who wants to connect with their ancestry, who maybe feels drawn to some of these practices, should they look up the history of them? What's the best practice? I know, this is a little outside of your scope, but how do you think they should move forward in a thoughtful way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, I'm not on TikTok, but I think from everything I've heard, I'm not sure WitchTok is the most robust way.
Okay.
But WitchTok certainly is introducing people to these ideas, which I think is a good thing. So I think of WitchTok very similarly to how I think of Wikipedia. It's a good place to start, but it can't be your only place. So I think if people are interested in connecting with their ancestry, the best way to do that is to talk to the elders in their families and in their communities and start there.
Oh, what a beautiful suggestion. I love that.
Yeah. Start there and see what they say. And they might be able to point you in directions that you didn't know were open and available to you. I think if your interest isn't necessarily connected to your family history, then I think doing research about the kind of practices that interest you. So if you're really into trees, read some books about trees. If you're really into the tides and the moon, do some research. So I think to me, because I'm an academic, I find empowerment through knowledge. And I think the first place that I would go if I thought, okay, I've heard people say that the tides and the moon are connected. I don't understand how. I'm going to go read a book about it.
Right.
And then I'll better understand it. And then that's where I'll be able to go. So I think finding out more about your family history and researching more about the parts of the natural world that move you and that excite you, I think there might be a convergence there that could help people feel empowered to be more connected.
I love that. Well said. I know you don't have a book and I know you don't have social media, but I do hope one day you write a book. So promise us that if you do, you'll reach back out and you can come back, because this has been just such a joy talking to you today.
I've loved it. And yeah, I mean, you will not be able to keep me away. When my book comes out, I'll be back.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Since you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to be a part of my private Facebook group. In there, I post content that I don't share anywhere else. You can talk to me directly about past and future episodes, and I even do occasional giveaways. Search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one about the set of U.S. laws that allowed legal roundup of suspicious-looking women. Yes, you heard that right. Episode 195. Stay tuned next week when I talk with a journalist asking the question if the Me Too movement was a positive step forward or a confusing one sideways. Until then, keep it curious.